2025 Formula 1 preseason testing is officially in the books, and we have plenty to unpack, finally seeing our 10 cars on track. 3 days of running, tons of laps, and some unexpected twists that have given us a first real look at where every team is standing. And while this is testing, obviously this is partially speculative. We haven't seen the full pace of these cars. We don't know the fuel loads. Lap times are pretty irrelevant. But you gotta base it off of the footage that you see, what the drivers are saying and team principles, and what was the balance of the car. Did it look good? Did it look fast? You can get a lot out of testing, but obviously the real stuff we're gonna see in Australia. So this is still a bit speculative, just to let you guys know. So if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and let's get started with our worst to best list. Kicking it off on 10, it's pretty easy to say that Sauber has got this position solidified. And look, obviously I don't want to just pile on Sauber here. They've had a rough time anyways in 24, but this test went wrong in every possible way for the team. The car was an absolute handful handling wise. It's easily the worst of the bunch. You could see Nico and Gabriel wrestling through every corner trying to get a lap time in. And looking at any race pace times, it was inconsistent. There was no real rhythm. And honestly, it's hard to say any redeeming qualities about the car. Like, they've changed it, but it's still the worst car. This might just be one of those seasons where the team has to limp home. There are upgrades supposedly coming to Australia. This is 80% of the car. They're missing another 20. But realistically, I think they need to add on a whole new car to actually get anywhere near the rest of the pack. I could be wrong, but it really feels that way. At number 9, it's Racing Bulls. Yep, Red Bull's sister team is all the way towards the bottom, like they typically are. Now, they did end up getting a ton of laps with Isaac and Yuki, and the reliability was pretty solid, so I gotta give them props there. But I never really saw anything outstanding out of the car. It wasn't very inspiring. The consistency wasn't really there in race pace, and there were moments where Isaac and Yuki were definitely fighting for the car when they were on those laps that they were pushing. It does feel like they're the lower part of the midfield. I don't think they're far from 8th to 5th. And I still think they're a better car than that of Sauber. It feels like an improvement on the car, but almost the same car with very few tweaks, if that makes sense. Even with the weird test, I got Haas in 8th place. They had a quietly solid test, nothing special and nothing unique, but they heavily focused on long runs. They did have some qualifying laps, but as I said, the car looked decent, nothing spectacular, and they gathered a mountain of data to work with. They didn't take a massive step forward. This is clearly a evolution and a small evolution that added from their previous car. And all signs really point to 2026 being the regulation period where they really want to get that jump start. So while I wouldn't count them out in 25, I also don't believe that this car will really gain too much pace through the season. They're probably going to be fighting for points, but not consistently. It also doesn't help that they have a brand new driver lineup, so it's going to take a little bit of adjusting for them, even in the races, to work with the team. In 7th place, I feel like 8th all the way down to 5th is extremely close and maybe within a 10th. But at 7, it's Alpine. And with things getting tricky here, it's going to be all those little minuscule things that's really going to tell me where I should place all these teams. It's a bit of feeling. It's also using the race pace and how the car's handling was. And I felt like out of 7, 6, and 5th, the car had the weakest handling. With having its struggles in understeer, it was very visible on screen to see when it was suffering through that. They've been pretty open about focusing on 26 and that being a big season for them, which makes sense because they also have a small evolution, but the car was better than that of Haas. I feel like them and Haas are probably going to have a decent start to the season, but as we continue longer into the season and more updates are put on other cars, that's when they're going to drop back. I still believe that Alpine is 7th, but I do believe they will be competitive, no podiums, but fighting for points consistently. At number 6, it's Aston Martin. This team started testing with a bang on day 1, and I don't necessarily mean that as in they were with Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren, but the car showed promise. It was a very well-balanced car in that first day, and quite planted and quick out of the gates. But by day 3, that's where we ended up seeing the cracks in this team, just like we saw last year. Tire degradation reared its ugly head again on the Aston Martin car. And specifically in the rear, like last year, it was eating into their long run pace, but there is a but. That said, Fernando Alonso had a pretty good final stint, and it was a bright spot in what wasn't the best test. They didn't have too many laps, which was unfortunate due to what they were running, and I think they were focusing more on the setup of the car and what they can actually go with. There were reports that they were setting up this car in a way that they can't even run it in race and qualifying just to see what are the limits of the car. but I do expect them to be a solid midfield contender here in the start of the season. And Alonso has been really focused on updates that are supposed to come later in the season, but we know how that goes with Aston. Supposedly, if one works, it can put them in the mix with the top guys, but that's saying a lot. The most shocking team for me in 5th place is Williams, with Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon. And what a turnaround. This team made the biggest jump in testing hands down. The car's handling looks sorted. Those wind sensitivity issues that plagued them so much in the previous seasons looked gone. The pace was genuinely impressive. They were close up on those times. As I said, lap time doesn't matter, but it was nice to see Williams up there. The drivers both seemed pretty comfortable pushing it. Carlos looked like he was a natural over there in Williams. And they've quietly built a platform that I think can fight for regular points early in the season. That's also another important thing to note. I do believe Williams, Alpine, and Haas all might go through the same type of trajectory in 2025, where they start the season strong, but as the season comes to an end, they're going to get weaker and weaker, focusing more on 26. I do believe Aston will be like that as well, but they have more updates in the pipeline. But big props to James and the team over there at Williams. It's so nice to see them doing well. I hope what we saw in testing is actually put onto track. Now, these are also just as tough as the midfield, and into the top 4, it's actually Red Bull. And yes, you heard that right. Red Bull to me is the 4th best team right now. Max spun twice in testing. I don't think I've seen him do this in a very long period of time. You can also see the frustration while Max was driving the car. Liam doesn't know much better than what he's driving right now. Max knows the limits of what the previous iterations of these Red Bulls was. And there were a couple of head shakes and just frustration overall when the car was visibly understeering midway through the corner. I don't think it's as bad as last year. They seem to have improved it a bit. On other days, race pace was impressive, but I do think that also Mercedes, McLaren, and Ferrari were all a little bit better. And it's definitely not the dominant machine we're used to. Max even thinks that it's tough to gauge where the car is. He says it's been an okay day, at least for day 3. And with Max saying it's okay, I think it's pretty easy to guess that this team is not fighting for wins in the start. At number 3, it's the team in red. We've got Ferrari. Now this car is super peaky. It's oversteery, but it's quick if you hit the sweet spot. It seems like a car that Leclerc is going to love, and I do think Hamilton will have to adjust, but he's driven cars like this before. Day 3 was a bit of a nightmare for both Ferrari fans and the team themselves. It showed their weak point in tire degradation, as the new suspension design is bold for the team to do in the last season, but it has insisted that everything is correlating perfectly within their sims. I don't believe they've shown us our full hand. I'm going off of testing, so that's why they're 3rd for me. If you told me about the first 2 days, I would have put them a little bit higher on the list, but day 3 did expose a bit of weaknesses. As always with Ferrari, it's high risk, high reward, and I really do hope it's glory, not heartbreak for Ferrari in 25. And dare I say it, the Mercedes car actually looked good in testing. I have them at number 2. This was the most promising test they've had in years. The car was fast, it was balanced, and it looked pretty competitive. Kimi was definitely turning some heads with how he was driving, very confident, easy on the brakes, the balance looked nice. And while tire degradation was a mixed bag, yet again going through the whole cold being good, hot being bad, like in 24. But even with them not being number 1, I believe they had the best car when it came to handling. And the confidence from both Kimi and George, and with the amount of curb they were taking, it really showed what the car's potential was. And the drivers weren't scared one bit to test out that potential. In number 1, I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that have watched testing. McLaren seems to be the blistering car coming out of 2025 testing. They were obviously the star, close to the best balance. I still believe that to be Mercedes, but the unreal tire management and the pace had everybody talking. The rear end tends to be a tad twitchy, but honestly, I'm just nitpicking at small things that I noticed on the McLaren. It's a rocket ship from what we've seen. Lando and Oscar both looked comfortable, but I do believe Lando to be the more comfortable out of the two, and they're going to be really tough to beat considering what we saw in those long runs. Australia is a unique track, but I do believe McLaren to be the number 1 team going into that track for our first race of the season. So that's all for my top 10 worst to best. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the comments below. I'd love to see what you guys say. Have you guys picked up on any different things that I did? Because yet again, nobody can predict these things, even if you're watching the cars in real life on track. We'll really only know after we've seen the full race in Australia. Please leave a like, subscribe, it would mean the world, and peace.